Yeah, there we go. Yeah, I think one thing we could talk about is the God one, God two distinction from Paul van der Kolk.
Right.
Um, I saw with your talk with Karen, you sort of said you're on board with God one and you like the idea of God one, but you don't like the idea of God two.
Well,
So
it's not
what's
like I
sort of your
don't like
problem?
it. It's not a matter of liking. It's a matter of making sense out of it. And to me, I have a hard time of making sense of what that would be, or how it would really. I mean, I do have some issues with the very concept, actually. And I think I've talked to many times about this, but the God one to me is the God of order. So it represents the laws of nature, um, and some of these laws are relatively simple, like the laws of physics. Although simple, some people would say they are hard to understand, like quantum mechanics especially. But they are simple in that there are laws that apply to complicated systems, but not complex systems. When we talk about the human world and laws of human world, we're talking about the laws of complexity, and these are very different kinds of laws.
Could you distinguish
It's very
between
much
those
more
two?
difficult to tease those out.
Could you distinguish between complexity and complex? I think it's sort of like it's the distinction sort of one you can for the so the difference between complex and
Yeah,
complicated.
complicated. Well, in every
Well, one you can
terminology,
disclose.
you can use the two interchangeably. I mean, people, I think that when they say, like, they could say a car engine is a complex thing, but in the formal sense of complexity theory, a car engine is not complex at all. It's very simple. It's a
Mhm.
maybe for somebody that's not a car mechanic, first time you open and tear it apart, and then you want to put it back together, it's going to look very complicated to you if you don't have any training, right?
Mhm.
It's very, it's simple in the sense that, if you look at the car as a whole, when you push on the accelerator pedal, the response is going to be very predictable.
Mhm.
Or if you change gears, or, I mean, you can make it act in a very predictable way. Complex systems are systems that are made up typically of very, very many interacting parts that are controlled at a local level, and then their interaction as a whole is basically unpredictable by any means whatsoever.
So this is essentially when you start to bring in emergence, when you get into complexity, I think, because
Yes. Well,
um, it seems like part of what you were talking about Laplace in the current discussion. He said he sort of thinks everything is just complicated, right? You can maybe that's one way of thinking about it. Everything is just complicated, and if you had enough, if you knew enough, you could sort of create this. You could sort of figure out determinately how one thing leads to another. Do you think that's a fair way of thinking about it?
yeah, in a complicated system, you could, in theory, figure out, the whole chain of event from, in the past to the future. I mean, typically you can represent a complicated system with a set of equations, like mathematical equations that determine, okay, if you do this action, this is going to be the outcome for certain. I mean, you can determine the outcome with a, but sometimes in some systems that are complicated, you can't determine a exact outcome, but you can at least determine a probability distribution of potential outcomes with boundaries.
Okay.
You can say, let's say you roll a die, all right? So 1 through 6. So, of course, in theory, if you knew all the parameters at the start when you throw the die, the theory is you could calculate which number is going to roll, 1 through 6. In practice, of course, what we end up doing is, well, we have probability distributions. It's 1/6 chance of 1 and 1/6 chance of 2, and so on and so on. If you have 2 die, we can figure out the probabilities of various numbers. But we know we're never going to, if you have 2 dice, you're never going to roll a 13, right? Because it's 6 and 6 is maximum, so 12. So there are some boundaries. In complex systems, that's not the case. Sometimes you might be able, there's all kinds of different complex systems. So, some act differently than others, but in general, it's not possible to predict outcomes based on a simple formulation, simple formula. Now you just have to iterate the steps to derive like a future state of the system. You can't do it, but for each initial set of initial conditions, you have to run the equations all the way to the time that you want to predict in the future. You can't do it in general. You have to do it for every single set. It's a different, potentially, so, and then the results are nonlinear. The results can be, the results will jump from one.
Hold on.
Yeah.
I don't know. She's out of clue. But it's clear. Sorry, there's a kid here.
Right. No, it's okay. So so the results in the complex systems are very, very unpredictable, and there are no. Oh, something going on.
They're having a water fight.
Oh, okay.
So, kids. So, yeah, you're saying the complex.
So you already mentioned it, but in certain complex systems, not all, but certain types of complex systems, you can have what's called emergence of certain properties that were not there until you reach a certain level of complexity. But very, very basic types of emergence, in relatively not complex, you can get emergence in systems that are not really complex, actually. Say you take, and the typical example that physicists use is the concept of temperature. The temperature, the temperature of a single proton or even a single atom doesn't make any sense. You have to have a whole set of atoms moving around to actually get something that you can call the temperature of a gas or of a solid.
That doesn't seem to be the same kind of emergence you're talking about when you're thinking of something like consciousness, because
no, but it is in the sense, of course, consciousness is much more complicated. In fact, David Chalmers calls it. He probably is the only case that he knows of what he calls a radical emergence. So that it emerges. The property of consciousness is radically different than the physical universe that it emerges from. Whereas temperature, like radically different. It's still pretty easy to relate it to the behavior of the individual particles forming, let's say, a gas.
I mean, couldn't you sort of, I'm going to show my ignorance, but couldn't you say something?
Can we pause for a second?
Sure. Just pause.